The next market structure we're going to look at is what we call oligopoly. This is a market structure dominated by a few large firms. There may be smaller firms in the market as well, but there are just a few large firms which are the ones that really are the chief people in the market. They're the ones that we're going to focus on. Where you have a few large firms, there can be very significant competition. Lots of markets are characterized by this kind of market structure: petrol, cars, cigarettes, and so on. So we're talking about a few large firms, always with fairly high barriers to the entry of new firms. It's going to be difficult for new firms to enter the market. How many firms are we talking about? 2, 3, 4, 5? We don't have a particular number, but the idea is that there are sufficiently few firms in this market dominating the market that it's characterized by what we call interdependence. And interdependence means that when one firm makes a significant decision, it has direct effects on other firms in the market. Go back to what we said about perfect competition. If you are a farmer in one part of the country growing your carrots, and a farmer near to you decides to double its output, how does that affect you? Not at all. What do you care? That's not going to change the price in the market. Now imagine that you are Toyota and you've just heard that Ford's plans to double the output of its cars. This is going to have a very direct effect upon you. So decisions taken by one firm have a direct effect on the other firms in the market. This is what we mean by interdependence. And so each firm takes its decision in the light of what other firms are doing. It's a bit like playing chess. You may start off by being white and moving your pawn forward. Black can't simply make a decision as to what is best for it without thinking what you've done. And when black has made its decision, your response has to be determined by what black has done. You can't take decisions independently of what your opponent is doing. Now, the other thing which characterizes oligopolistic markets is that firms compete not only on price, but also on non-price variables, the amount of advertising, the volume of research and development, and so on. But in this lecture, we're just going to focus on price competition and ask, how do prices get formed in this kind of market? Now, as we do that, you might expect me to do what we've done with perfect competition and monopoly, where I said to you, this is perfect competition, here is the model of perfect competition. Then when we looked at monopoly, I said, this is monopoly, here is the model. So you might reasonably expect me to do the same thing here and to say, I'm now going to describe to you the theory of how oligopolistic prices get set, but I can't do that. And the reason I can't do that is because of the interdependence of firms. Go back to my chess illustration. If you start off by moving your king's pawn forwards, there are some responses that black could make, which is clearly stupid, but there's 6, 7, 8 perfectly reasonable responses that black has. When black has responded, there are now 7 or 8 perfectly reasonable moves that you might make, and so on. It's the same with reacting to rivals' decisions. So some economists have said, I think that when firms behave in this way, other firms will react in that way. Other economists have said, no, I think they will react in the following way. So we don't have a model for oligopoly. We have a large number of models making different assumptions about the way in which rivals react to one another. Now, we don't have time to look at many of these models, but we are going to look at two. And the first one, which we call the kinked demand theory, for reasons I'll explain very shortly, assumes that firms take decisions without looking for cooperation from other firms. That although they take note of what the other firm is doing, they don't get together and agree price and output decisions. Then the second model we'll look at assumes that in fact firms do get together and do work out ways of cooperating. But the first of these two models we're going to look at assumes that firms don't do that, and the particular model that we're going to consider is called the kinked demand theory. And once we start looking at this model, it becomes immediately obvious why it's called the kinked demand theory. And what we're looking for is how prices get determined in this kind of oligopolistic market. It's called the kinked demand theory because it assumes that there is a kink in the demand curve of each firm. And I'll draw that for you now. It assumes that each firm faces a demand curve which is not a straight line, but which has a very real kink to it, where at the kink we have the current level of prices. I'll call it P1. And the level of output which you are producing, I'll call Q1. What's the explanation for the kink? It goes like this. We are considering raising our price. If we raise our price, let's say to P2, we're going to lose a huge amount of sales. And the reason for that is to be found in the assumption about how our rivals will react. The theory suggests that if we raise our price, our opponents will do nothing. We are now relatively expensive, and lots of our customers will now transfer to the opposition. So we'll lose a lot of sales as a result of our raising our price. But what about if we lower our price to, say, P3? The kink suggests that we'll hardly sell any more output at all. And the reason for this is, again, because of an assumption about our rivals' reaction to our behaviour. The assumption this time is that if we lower our price, our opponents are not going to allow us to increase our market share at their expense. They'll follow us down. And so at the lower price, we won't sell very much more because we won't gain market share. So if we raise price, we lose market share and a lot of sales. If we lower price, we don't gain market share and we don't sell very much more. So that's the logic of the kink in the demand curve. Now, we've seen before that if a firm is to maximize profits, it will always set a price and output decision such that marginal cost equals marginal revenue. It's always worth expanding output if it adds more to revenue than to cost. So what we next need to do is, having established the demand curve, we need now to establish the marginal revenue curve, and then we can work out what's the appropriate price and output decision where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So now we have to think, given the nature of the demand curve with this kink in it, what does that suggest about the marginal revenue curve? And it looks strange, but we can work out why. given the kink in the demand curve, the marginal revenue curve looks like this. Marginal revenue falls faster than the demand, faster than average revenue for exactly the same reasons that we've seen with the monopolist. But now, if we lower price, marginal revenue drops pretty much vertically, so that marginal revenue looks like that given the average revenue curve. Now, it's probably not at all obvious why that's the case. So we'll just do a little example and see why it's like that. And the example we'll do is to use some numbers, some of which we've met before when we looked at monopoly. Here's my set of numbers representing a demand curve with a kink in it. This first part of the demand curve is exactly what we've seen before when we looked at the monopolist, but notice now that in order to sell more, we have to have a big price cut. We're selling at the moment at 70p and we're selling 4 units of output. Now we wish to sell an extra unit of output. Given the assumptions of the kink in the demand curve, it takes a large price cut from 70 to 50p to induce an extra unit of sales because everyone wants to follow us down. So what happens to total revenue? Total revenue goes from 4 lots of 70p, £2.80 a week, or 5 lots of 50, £2.50 a week. So what happens to marginal revenue? Marginal revenue has gone from 40p to minus 30p. There is a huge drop in marginal revenue because it is so hard to get an extra unit of sales if other people are going to follow us down. We have to have a large price cut because we're not going to get away with cutting prices and increasing market share. Other people will follow us down. So that explains why the marginal revenue curve is what it is. This discontinuous section, this vertical drop in marginal revenue because of the assumptions that we've made with the kink in the demand curve. So we've now established the demand curve, we've established the marginal revenue curve. Now we think about how price gets set. How does price get set? We need to think, where is marginal cost equal to marginal revenue? So let's draw in the marginal cost curve and see where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. The marginal cost curve looks like so. So that marginal cost equals marginal revenue at this level of output. We'll call it 4 units of output at a price of 70p. So here's my firm maximizing profits, producing where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Now, what makes this particularly interesting is what happens to price output decisions of firms when costs change. Imagine that this is a company like Shell selling its petrol at 70p a litre. And now let's think, what would happen if there's an increase in oil prices? So marginal costs are shifting up because we've now got to pay more to buy a barrel of oil. How are we going to react to the increase in production costs? Well, what you'd expect to happen, and what you would get for a monopolist, is that now that marginal costs are higher, marginal cost equals marginal revenue at a lower level of output and at a higher price. So the monopoly model predicts an increase in costs. The response to that is less output, higher price. Now see what happens when there's a kink in the demand curve. Let's go back to the diagram. Here's the increase in production costs. Marginal cost shifts upwards. What's the profit maximizing response to the increase in production costs? Answer: do nothing. Marginal cost equals marginal revenue at the same level of output and at the same price. Why? Because we're afraid to pass on the higher costs in the form of higher prices, because we're going to lose a lot of market share. We'll keep our prices stuck at the same level of output as before. Furthermore, if marginal production costs fall, say oil prices come down, will this lead to our reducing our prices? It won't. We keep our prices the same and simply make more profit. Why don't we cut price now that our costs are lower? Because we won't sell very much more. Everybody else will follow us down. So over a range of cost changes, there's no change in the level of prices which maximizes our profits. This idea is known in the jargon as sticky prices, that prices stick at the same level even in response to cost changes. Now, it doesn't mean that prices never change. If costs go on and on rising, there comes a point where we're simply going to have to increase our prices simply to stay in business. And if we're unfortunate, other companies may keep their prices the same and we'll lose a lot of market share. If we're more fortunate, they've also been experiencing these cost increases. They've all wanted to raise price, and this time they will raise their prices alongside of ours and will move up to a higher price with a new kink. But the important thing is that over some range of cost changes, prices stick. And the reason why some economists are particularly keen on this idea of the kink demand curve is that there are industries where just this has been observed. There are markets like petrol and cigarettes where prices do change, but not as fast and not as often as the changes in costs of production. So it's an explanation as to why that's the case. The kink demand curve gives us a believable explanation of why prices stick for some while at a given level. Now, there are other economists who are not very impressed with this kind of argument, and they have two objections to it. You might think these things through and decide to what extent you agree with these. But the two objections that some economists have to this idea of sticky prices is that first, it doesn't really give an explanation of why the kink is in the place that it is. It explains why prices stick at a particular level, but it doesn't tell us why the kink was, in my case, at 70p in the first case. So it's not a very powerful explanation of the determination of prices, only an explanation of why prices stick at a given level once they've been determined. The other thing is that you can think of alternative explanations for sticky prices without resorting to an assumption of a kink in the demand curve. An alternative explanation would be found in what we call transactions costs. Now, transactions costs are the costs associated with making transactions, not the costs in producing the product in the first place. So when a firm produces some output, there are these direct costs of manufacturing and so on, and the labour costs, and the capital costs, and the transport costs. But there are some costs associated with the making of transactions. So the company has to advertise. It has to produce a price list so that people know what the prices are that are being charged for their products. These are the transactions costs. And transactions costs give an explanation for sticky prices. You have a very expensive restaurant, and you've decided to make it a French restaurant, and you produce your menus, and they are beautifully produced in your own perfect copper-plated handwriting. Beef stroganoff, £37.50. And it's taken you ages to print, to produce and handwrite these beautiful menus. Now, having done it, next week the price of cream goes up. Now you wish you were charging £37.55. Are you really going to rewrite all the menus? No, you're going to say, the transactions costs are too high. I don't want to rewrite all the menus. It's too expensive in terms of my time. I'm going to keep my prices the same. Next week, beef prices go up by a few percent. No, I'm not going to change prices. But after a while, if all of your costs keep on going up, there comes a point where you rewrite all the menus and it's now beef stroganoff, £42.50. What are you doing? You are not constantly adjusting your prices. You've allowed your prices to stick. Have they stuck because of a kink in the demand curve? Not at all. They've stuck because of the high transactions costs. So you'll sometimes see companies producing price lists in which they say, this is our list of prices until the end of April next year. But costs might change in the meantime. Yep, but it's too expensive to rewrite the list of prices. We're going to keep our prices the same even if costs change. Sticky prices, quite independent of any considerations about the kink in the demand curve. So that's one view of how oligopolistic prices get determined, the kink demand curve. Now there's a second approach that we're going to think about now, and that is, this one makes a completely different assumption, and it says, where there are only a few large firms in the market, there is a tendency for firms to get together and agree a common price. They're no longer competing, they're getting together to set a price. What price? Well, the logic, if they get together, is to say, what's the price we would have charged if we were a monopolist? That's the price that maximizes the joint profits of the companies involved. This is called a cartel, where companies get together and establish an agreement about prices, form a cartel. What's the logic of the cartel? Well, one way of understanding it is to take an example from a different situation and think through what's going on. And this is usually done in economics with what is known as the prisoner's dilemma. And the prisoner's dilemma goes like this. You and your mate have robbed a bank, and the police have caught you with money that you stole from the bank, so they can charge you with receiving stolen money and send you down for a year in jail. They don't have enough evidence to convict you of the major charge of robbing the bank. So what they do is they put you and your mate in separate cells and come to each of you and say, you're going to spend a long time in jail. We'll make you an offer. We'll get you a reduction in your sentence if you confess. They only need one of you to confess to be able to convict both of you. How are you going to respond to this offer? Well, we can plot the possible responses that you might make in the form of a matrix, and the matrix will look like this. This is you, and this is your mate, her, and you realize that you can don't confess, or you can confess. And you realize that your mate might don't confess or confess. So there are 4 possible options. Suppose you don't confess and your mate doesn't confess. You each get just 1 year in jail. They don't have enough evidence to convict you of the major charge of robbing the bank, just the minor charge of receiving stolen property. So I'll write down your year in jail, -1, and then your friend's -1. Now we'll think what happens if you don't confess, but she does. Because you didn't confess, there's no reduction on your sentence. You get 10 years in jail. She would have got 10 years in jail, but she's confessed. So she only has to spend 5 years in jail. Suppose you confess, but she doesn't confess. You only spend 5 years in jail. You got relief on your sentence. She didn't. She has 10 years. Suppose you both confess. Well, you both do 5 years in jail. So this is your matrix. Are you going to confess or not? I can't be sure, but I'm going to tell you what I think is the most likely thing. I think you will adopt a fairly conservative strategy and say, what's the worst that could happen to me if I confess? I could spend 5 years in jail. What's the worst I could do if I don't confess? I might spend 10 years in jail. On that basis, I'll take a decision to minimize the amount of time I spend in jail given the worst possible outcome. I'm going to confess. What's your opponent going, your friend going to do? If your friend uses the same reasoning, she's going to say, what's the worst I could do if I don't confess? 10 years in jail. What's the worst I could do if I confess? 5 years in jail. I think she's going to confess. And you're both going to spend 5 years in jail. What makes this even more likely is that if you think about what she's going to do and think that she might work out what you're going to do, she's going to think that you're likely to confess, in which case it certainly pays her to confess. Well, if she's going to confess, it certainly pays you to confess. Now, here's the important thing. You have both behaved entirely rationally, and you've both finished up spending more time in jail than you needed to have done. You both would be better off if you had not confessed, but you behaved entirely rationally. So we have an interesting result here, that you can behave rationally and finish up worse off. What's this got to do with pricing? Well, why did you behave in the way in which you did? Because there was uncertainty about the way in which your friend was going to behave. If you knew that she wasn't going to confess, well, of course, you wouldn't confess either. It was decision-making in the presence of uncertainty. Well, what is true for the jail situation is true for 2 firms in an oligopoly. If you can eliminate the uncertainty by agreeing, you can both do better. We could rewrite the same matrix with high and low price. The best is that we both charge a high price. but we're both scared to set a high price in case the other one sets a low price and we lose most of our share of the market. The result is that we both charge a low price, even though we would be both better off setting a high price. So getting together is a way of eliminating the uncertainty. And this is what the cartel does. Unfortunately for the producers, although we can now see why the cartel develops, the cartel is inherently unstable. Having agreed a high price, you now both have an incentive to cheat. Having established the high price, the likelihood is that you will each think, I could do better now by lowering my price and trying to increase my market share, still with a pretty high price. In order to establish the high price, we had to reduce output. We've raised prices in the industry, so we've had to take some output cut. And we've looked for the profit maximizing monopoly price. So we've agreed to do that. Maybe we've raised prices by 20% and only cut output by 5%. We're both doing much better. But wouldn't it be wonderful if now with that 20% higher price, I could offer a 5% discount to my customers? Until your opponent discovers that they're not selling as much as they expected. And they realize you're cheating and they begin to cheat as well. And the cartel unravels. So although cartels are easily formed, it's relatively difficult to keep them operating over a long period of time. What further makes this more difficult is that cartels are illegal in most Western economies. Because they result in higher prices to consumers, governments have mostly got powers to try to prevent cartels from developing. And over a period of years, the cartel legislation has become more and more severe. So what happens now if you operate a cartel? There are a number of things which the law has in place to try to make it difficult for you to sustain it. If you operate a cartel, governments have the power, if they suspect you are operating a cartel, to go in for what are called dawn raids. They can turn up at your offices in the middle of the night, smash open the doors of your offices, break in, steal computers, take away documents, look for evidence that you've been operating a cartel. If they find it, then you can be fined. What's the level of the fine? The maximum in Europe is the 10% of turnover. Not 10% of profit, 10% of turnover. That might wipe out 2 years of your profits. So it's a considerable fine, although some economists think it should be much bigger. So we've got dawn raids and we've got considerable fines. We've got more than that. In recent years, it's been possible for the people who've been caught operating cartels to be thrown into jail. There are prison sentences for senior executives who are caught getting together with other companies in the industry. A relatively recent addition has also been what's called the Whistleblower Situation, where companies are told, if you have formed a cartel, but you confess, this is like going back to our example with the prisoner's dilemma, if you come and confess, then you can be let off relatively lightly. And the reason this is done is because it considerably increases the likelihood that the authorities can get sufficient evidence to be able to make a charge against you stick. And in recent years, we've seen a number of industries, cement, lift manufacture, other industries as well, airlines, who have been caught operating cartels. And in some of these countries, in some of these industries, the way it's been discovered has been because somebody has been a whistleblower and been to the authorities to say, yes, we confess. So cartels are easily established, but very difficult to maintain. So now we have perfect competition. We've looked at monopoly and seen that the monopolist charges a higher output, a lower output, higher price. Oligopoly, a number of firms competing, but because they have to compete, they may well eliminate the competition by the establishment of a cartel. But cartels are A, illegal, and B, difficult to sustain. In the next lecture, we'll think about how efficient or inefficient these market structures are, not so much for producing welfare to the companies, but for welfare for the consumer of these products.